Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week, on our Against the Odds poll, it was Aetherflux Reservoir coming in as by far the most popular of our options. So this week, we are heading to Kaladesh Standard to play a deck that is essentially a Storm deck. We are playing Aetherflux Storm, looking to kill our opponent in one big turn. I'm really excited to test this deck out. Storm is a broken mechanic, and it facilitates really busted decks in Vintage and in Legacy, even in Modern. So it's really surprising and rare that Wizards would put something that's even close to a Storm combo deck in the Standard format. So I think it's going to be fun. We're going to be doing something that's very different than what anything else in Standard is doing. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break it down. If you enjoy this Aetherflux Storm deck and Against the Odds in general, it would be awesome of you if you could take a minute, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. We're closing in on 50,000 subs thanks to all of you being so awesome, and it would be super sweet if you could help us reach that goal. Anyway, let's talk Aetherflux Storm. So, of course, the namesake card, the key card, the most important card of the deck, Aetherflux Reservoir, a 4-mana artifact. Whenever we cast a spell with it on the battlefield, we gain a life for each spell we've cast this turn. So, first spell, 1 life, second spell, 2 life, 9th spell, 9 life. Essentially, once we get an Aetherflux Reservoir out, we want to cast about 9 spells, which just so happens to be the same number of spells you need to cast for Tendrils of Agony, one of the big Storm cards from the past, to kill the opponent for 4 mana. So you kind of have this comparison to Tendrils of Agony, except you need the Aetherflux on the battlefield before you start casting the spells, and Tendrils you need to cast it after you've cast the spells, but really it's very similar in that way, because if we cast 9 spells, we should gain enough life that we can activate the second ability on Aetherflux Reservoir, which is pay 50 life, deal 50 damage to a creature or player. So we're going to be throwing that at our opponent's face. We're not planning on using it to shoot down our opponent's Sylvan Advocate or Servant of the Conduit. So basically, that is the deck. We find an Aetherflux Reservoir, we cast the spells, we win the game. So that's the plan, that's what we're doing, hopefully it works out. Inventor's Fair is important for 2 reasons. For one thing, it lets us tutor up our Aetherflux Reservoir, and we really need 1 or even more, they do stack well, Aetherflux Reservoirs on the battlefield to win the game. And it also just incidentally gains us life, so that helps keep our life total high, maybe even gets us up to 25 life, to 30 life before we start comboing off, which means we need to cast less spells for Aetherflux Reservoir to be lethal. So how do we go about casting enough spells in 1 turn to storm off and win with Aetherflux Reservoir? Well, there's been a couple different versions of this deck. One of them is a version that plays 0 mana artifacts like Bonesaw, Cathars Shield. The problem is those cards are horrible and they do nothing if you're not comboing off. So I really wanted to avoid playing Cathars Shield and Bonesaws. So instead, we are looking to play functional, decent artifacts, but make those cheaper with Foundry Inspector and Herald of Kozilek. So these are 3 drops. They curve into our Aetherflux Reservoir. So we play this on turn 3. On turn 4, we can play our Aetherflux. And they make all of our artifacts, or for Herald, colorless spells, which includes all of our artifacts, but they make them cost 1 less to cast. So for our deck to really combo off, we need at least 1 of these on the battlefield. 2 is ideal. If we have 2, our deck can go really insane. If we have 1, it's a little harder, but it's still possible. But these are really key pieces for storming off in our deck. So we want at least 1 or 2 of these on the battlefield. Then we play our Aetherflux Reservoir, and then we're looking to cast a bunch of artifacts that draw us cards, and will hopefully be free. So these cards, if we have 2 of our cost reduction creatures on the battlefield, all of these cards are free. Terrarion is free even with 1 of them. The 2 big ones are Prophetic Prism and Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot. So basically, these are 2 mana, and they're artifacts, and they draw us a card. So they don't cost us a card. Ideally, they'll be free if we have those cost reduction effects. So it's just draw a card, cycles through our deck, finds more spells to cast to keep upping that storm count so we can get the 9 spells we need in 1 turn. Hedron Archive might not look like it, but if we have 2 cost reduction effects on the battlefield, it is also free because we pay 2 to cast it, but we can immediately tap it for 2 mana. So is helpful there as an additional free spell, and then we can sack it to draw cards, which is really neat if we're running out of action, maybe a spell or two short from actually getting the 50 life or 50 or more life we need to win. We can sack the Hedron Archive, draw a couple cards, hopefully find more Prophetic Prisms, Metal Spinners, Puzzle Knot, or Terrarion. So Terrarion may be the worst of the bunch because it doesn't draw a card when it enters the battlefield. We have to sack it to draw a card, but it's only 1 mana, so it's free when we have only 1 cost reduction effect on the battlefield. And it does a couple other neat things in our deck. There's a couple other synergies that we'll get to. We also have Metalwork Colossus, which is actually one of the synergies with Terrarion. So Metalwork Colossus in our deck isn't really a beater. We're not looking to kill our opponent by attacking with Metalwork Colossus. Instead, we're using it as another free artifact. So if we get enough Prophetic Prisms, Metal Spinners, Puzzle Knots, Hedron Archives, Terrarions on the battlefield, Metalwork Colossus is just a free artifact. Yes, it's a 10/10 creature. In theory, it could win us the game. More likely, it's a blocker that keeps us alive. But the combination of Metalwork Colossus plus Sanctum of Ugin, which can let us search up more Metalwork Colossuses, means that when we're storming off, we can cast a Colossus, hopefully sack Sanctum, get another Colossus, and just keep upping the storm count by casting multiple Colossuses in the same turn to get up to the 50 life we need to win with Aetherflux Reservoir. Also, it comes back from the graveyard, so we can do some neat tricks once we get a Colossus in the graveyard, where we can sack, for example, Terrarion and a Metalwork Colossus from the battlefield. Terrarion, if we sack it to Metalwork Colossus, draws us a card, which is the other nice synergy with Terrarion. But we do that, we get a Colossus back to our hand, we cast the Colossus, we sack another Colossus, and an artifact, get the Colossus back to our hand, so we can kind of generate a ton of storm count by sacking and looping Colossuses from the graveyard once we have them all going. So just by itself, the Colossus package combined with some artifacts to sack can get maybe 4 or 5 storm count all by itself just by looping and sacking them together. And then we have the big finisher in our deck, Paradoxical Outcome. So essentially, this lets us pick up all of our Prophetic Prisms, all of our Puzzle Knots, our Terrarions, our Hedron Archives, and replay them. And remember, ideally, by the time we're doing this, those cards are going to be free. So we can go Prophetic Prism, Puzzle Knot, Hedron Archive, Paradoxical Outcome for 4 mana, pick all those cards back up, Prophetic Prism, Metal Spinners, Puzzle Knot, Hedron Archive. That right there is 9 storm count. That wins us the game on the spot. And in theory, we can do this as early as like turn 5, probably, with our best draw, where we have multiple cost reduction effects and the Aetherworks Marvel. But this is the card that makes us win the games. Aside from the Aetherflux Reservoir, Paradoxical Outcome is the most important card in our deck because it keeps fueling us and allows us to cast enough spells in a turn. It's essentially, if you look at a modern Storm deck, they use Past in Flames, so they can double use all their spells in a turn. You cast all your rituals, your Manamorphoses, your cantrips, then you cast Past in Flames, which gives them all flashback, and then you cast your rituals, your cantrips, your Manamorphoses again. So essentially each spell is double your storm count when you have Past in Flames. Paradoxical Outcome is the Past in Flames in our deck. It lets each of our Prophetic Prisms count as 2 towards our storm count instead of just 1, and that's usually necessary for us to get that critical mass of 9 spells in 1 turn. We also have just a couple Glimmer of Genius. Not great when we're comboing off because it's expensive, but it does help us set off the combo. So a lot of times we'll cast this at the end of our opponent's turn, the turn before we're going to try to storm off, and find Prophetic Prisms, Paradoxical Outcomes, whatever we need to win the game. As far as the rest of the mana base, Wandering Fumarole, Spirebluff Canals, and some basics, pretty straightforward. In the sideboard, we're really focused on 2 things. For one thing, we're focused on surviving against control decks. Control decks, if they just overload on counterspells, are miserable matchups. It's just like the Aetherworks Marvel deck in Standard. You look great when no one's disrupting you, but when your opponent negates the only card that matters in your deck, in our case, the Aetherflux Reservoir, all of a sudden things look horrible. So Dispel, pretty straightforward, counters a counter spell that's targeting our Aetherflux Reservoir or our Paradoxical Outcome. Spell Shrivel is unique. It has Devoid, which means it picks up on the cost reduction effect from our Herald of Kozilek. So for 2 mana, if we have a Herald of Kozilek, or even 1 mana if we have double Herald of Kozilek, we can counter a spell unless our opponent pays 4. So it can almost be an additional Dispel if we have our cost reduction effects on the battlefield. So these come in to help us fight through control. And then we have some removal to help against aggro. So that is Aetherflux Storm for Standard, and I don't know. I think this deck is going to be really sweet, and it's going to do crazy things, but I'm very worried because a lot of control decks are running around on Magic Online right now, so I'm expecting we're going to run into some matchups where we just get countered out of the game. And there's a lot of really good aggro decks. When people play Verdurous Gearhulk and just beat down with huge creatures or Smuggler's Copters backed up by a bunch of 1-drops, I'm really wondering if we're going to be fast enough to combo off before our opponent kills us. So I'm not sure our record is going to be absurdly good, but I think we're going to do some absurdly cool things, and it's going to be a really fun deck to play. I'm just excited because, like I said before, Wizards think Storm is broken. I mean, the Storm scale, which ranks mechanics as to how likely they are to ever come back and be reprinted, is named after Storm because Storm is the least reprintable mechanic probably in the entire history of Magic. Wizards is not going to print Storm again, but they kind of did in Aetherflux Reservoir. So I'm really excited just because the very fact that this deck exists, and also that the deck exists and we're not playing Bonesaw, because Bonesaw feels so miserable. So we found a way to do it without Bonesawing and without playing Cathar's Shield and other just really bad cards. So we'll see how it goes. Regardless, it's going to be fun. Anyway, that's been our deck tech for Aetherflux Storm in Standard. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.